Less welcome tenants. The three humans remained at a polite distance, giving Reed Piper room to work. Lutomisla was struck again with how young he was to have such an important responsibility. The argument that the sandfishers were moving away from their traditional lives of fishing the Semerlak in favour of harvesting weirwood and clearing forests was belied by the number of serious-faced orcs observing the little ceremony. Reed Piper lifted up one of his effigies, about the size of a newborn baby, and showed it to the crowd who nodded and murmured. He made them himself, from a mix of lakeshore mud and dragonbone, sealed with a cunning amber-gilt glaze. It was a beautiful piece of work, the kind of thing that would not look out of place in a Sarvosan art gallery. With careful reverence, he laid it on a little reed raft and carefully lit the 9 cones of incense that surrounded it. She glanced over the little harbour. There were more orcs watching from their flat-bottomed boats and rafts they favoured. She'd not seen the quayside so still and quiet in all her time here. Reed Piper was talking now, and Lutomisla closed her eyes, shutting out the sounds of water and lakebird to focus on the words, on the cadence. It wasn't a spell, or a ritual, or even a ceremony. Just a short statement making it clear this offering was out of respect, and asking that the inhabitant of the lake take it rather than one of those who fished along its shore. When she opened her eyes again, the little raft, the last of 3, was already underway. Reed Piper had presumably given it the same little push he'd used on its siblings, which, interestingly, were still moving away from the shore, in defiance of what Lutomisla understood about the way little reed rafts should perform. There was some magic here, at least, just not anything she could dissect, but the forms and shapes were familiar enough, and she was already considering how it might be scaled up to something the Empire could use. She was aware of a light tugging at her sleeve, and looked down to find an orc child smiling up at her a little shyly. Without speaking, they pressed something into her hand, a folded piece of paper, then held out that same hand, flat, towards her in the universal sign for, "I was given to understand there would be payment." Lutomisla handed over a ring, and the child ran off happily with their prize. The ceremony was over. Gawain and Marie were deep in conversation with Reed Piper. The fisherfolk had turned back to their work. She unfolded the piece of paper, then shook her head and sighed deeply. The paper was embossed with the civil service horse, but the drawing scrawled across it was more enthusiastic than artful. Without the labels, she'd have struggled to be sure what it depicted. A massive dam, an empty Semerlak, and what was clearly intended to be the creature that dwelled in its depths, on its back with its legs in the air, dead. Next to it, a big red question mark. Rolling her eyes, Lutomisla crumpled the paper up and tossed it into the lake, but there was a rueful smile on her face as she went down to join the others by the water. Behind her, the crumpled piece of paper floated for a few moments, then jerked suddenly beneath the surface of the Semerlak with an almost audible plop. A couple of little bubbles rose up where it had been, and then nothing. Overview. During the spring equinox, the senators for Hallberg and Semmerholm, Caspar Yakovich von Hallberg and Amicia of the Semerlak, proposed an appraisal to explore solutions to the problems of Duala killing imperial citizens and interfering with matters on and around the Semerlak. The Senate concurred, and the Varushkin Kabbalist Lutomisla Niegoslava was dispatched to the northwest of the Empire to begin assessing the situation there. She visited and spoke with people around the Semerlak and put together a set of proposals, each of which will deal with the problem of Duala interfering with imperial citizens. At the same time, Galen Embercast, the Cardinal of Vigilance, requested that the Silent Bell investigate the threat that the sovereign Duala poses to imperial citizens around the Semerlak and how it might be countered virtuously. In this particular instance, the efforts of the vigilant sodality were in parallel to those of the prognosticator's office. The actual threat of the Semerlak is fairly obvious, and they concern themselves primarily with the second part of the Cardinal's request, finding ways for the virtuous to counter the influence of the sovereign. Fishers and burghers. Lutomisla has spoken with the sand fisher orcs about their odd ceremonies. The senators requested that, if possible, Lutomisla should ensure as part of the appraisal to speak with the sand fisher orcs of Misericord. As a consequence, the first port of call for the prognosticator is Holberg, or more specifically, Misericord, the region ceded to the sandfishers when they arrived from Ossium. Along with several League citizens familiar with the orcs, she petitions for and receives an invitation to visit the surprisingly busy little fishing port the orcs have established on the shores of the Semerlach. It's been noted that the sandfishers maintain a quiet tradition of making offerings to the Semerlach, in which they place beautifully carved wooden images or carefully shaped clay effigies on little reed rafts and float them out into the lake for Dualla to claim if she wishes. The sandfishers waste no time directing Lutomisla to a cheerful young orc named Reed Piper, who is apparently the latest in a long line of orcs entrusted with arranging seasonal sacrifices to the lake. An artist with a strong connection to a sandpiper ancestor also named Reed Piper, he explains that his people have always shown respect to the lake and the monster that dwells in its depths. The Druge turned a blind eye to their ceremonies because occasionally they would draw on the sandfishers' expertise to let them bargain with Undertow. The discussion proves quite illuminating, and Lutomisla is prevailed upon to spend a not inconsiderable sum on several of Reed Piper's beautifully decorated clay figurines. Her assessment is that there isn't anything innately special about the effigies or the rafts. It seems that the magical significance of the action lies in the ceremony and the offering. It's a hearth magic, likely drawing on concepts of worth common to many orc cultures. Dualla responds to the implied respect, to the symbolic tribute delivered to it. The single-minded obsession that many of Dualla's creatures show with recovering items that have been drowned in the lake, and the sovereign's insistence that things in its depths belong to them, including living humans and orcs, speaks to the creature's desire to receive sacrifices. It covets and jealously guards both offerings and the bounty of sunken ships. Reed Piper provides a warning, however. As the sandfisher's prosperity has increased, the sovereign is unsatisfied unless the offerings include more valuable materials than mere clay and wood. It's not causing too much trouble for the orcs. Everyone knows that if they want to avoid inconvenient flooding and attacks from Dualla's creatures, they need to pay the price. But it has implications for the Empire. Tribute to the lake. The Senate could arrange for regular offerings to be made to Dualla to propitiate her covetous nature. It may rankle with the Imperial Synod, but Lutomisla proposes that one way to reduce the threat to citizens would be to adapt and scale up the practices of the sandfishers. A small jetty and a squat tower would be built on the shores of the Semerlach. Any region that borders the lake would be appropriate. Reed Piper has confirmed that his people are preparing to let the Empire build in Misericord if they wish. It is the only part of Holberg that borders the lake itself, although the civil service cautions that if the Senate chooses to do so, the sandfishers will be able to remove access to the Semerlach toll booth at will. A couple of local civil servants would work with artists and artisans to acquire suitable offerings each season, ensuring they incorporated amounts of dragonbone, iridescent gloaming, and small pieces of weirwood, fairly easily sourced in the woods of Varushka and Dawn. These objects would then be packed into a small boat and sent out over the lake for the sovereign to claim as she wishes. Dualla would claim this tribute instead of feeling the need to prey on the merchant vessels that ply the waters, or take her tithe of the folk living around the lake. The main cost of this proposal is the price of the pieces of fine art and valuable materials that would make up the offerings. After some careful divinations and further discussions with magicians and artists from the three nations involved, she believes that 30 thrones a season would be needed from the imperial treasury to provide acceptable tribute to the sovereign. As long as the offerings continued, Dualla will cease her attacks on ships traversing the Semerlach, and their attacks against communities around the lake. Dualla would still be a potential problem, but no worse than that presented by any other sovereign. As long as people are careful and remain vigilant, the threat would be contained and the current problems dealt with. The Semerlak Toll Booth. Commission type, Folly. Location, any region of Ossium, Karov, Karsk, Weirwater, Semerholm or Hallberg, bordering the Semerlak. Cost, 12 Weirwood, 36 crowns and 3 months. Upkeep, 30 thrones each season. Effect, propitiates Duala, removing the threat to merchant vessels and reducing attacks on imperial territories. Virtues of prosperity. The Silent Bell have secured a promise of aid from prosperous merchants in Hallberg. They seek the guidance of the Assembly of Prosperity. In their pursuit of ways for the virtuous to combat the threat of Duala, the Silent Bell are brought into contact with an informal council made up of half a dozen Hallberg guilds that rely on the lake for transporting goods and their contacts in Dawn and Verushka. Calling themselves the Water Road Ring, they have suffered significant losses since Duala started preying on ships crossing the Semerlak. They are very interested in what Lutomisla learns from the Sandfishers and keen to support her proposal. However, they are also concerned that doing so might risk leaving them open to accusations of idolatry. Recent statements of principle, including one from Viviane Barossa de Courdefour, the Cardinal of Ambition, have increased their concern. They believe that paying tribute to Duala is no different to paying tariffs when a ship visits a foreign port, or the tolls sometimes paid to cross bridges or use roads owned by private individuals. The sovereign claims the Semerlak and demands tribute from those who use it, and it is not unvirtuous to pay those tolls, even though they are demanded by a supernatural creature. They aren't sure if the Synod agrees with them, however. The Silent Bell suggests that the Prosperity Assembly could step in and reassure not only the Water Road Ring, but other imperial citizens that this tribute is not an issue. All that is worthwhile is shared with those who deserve it. We send, named priest, with 50 liao to reassure the faithful that it is not unvirtuous or idolatrous to pay tolls or tribute, as long as this is payment and not an offering. Synod Mandate, Prosperity Assembly. If this mandate is passed, it will have two effects. The Water Road Ring and their allies in other nations will contribute to the Semerlak toll booth, helping to source works of art and materials to preserve their own prosperity. This will reduce the upkeep from the Senate treasury to 20 thrones a season. In the event the Senate chooses not to build the toll booth, the merchant princes of the League will still be reassured and work with the Sandfishers to offer their own tribute, removing the penalty to fleets trading from Hallberg, and only Hallberg. Defenders of the Semerlak. Knights and wardens from Dawn and Verushka are already doing their best to defy Duala. The Senate could recognize these groups and support their efforts. There is little appetite for propitiating the sovereign in Dawn. While their statement did not receive a greater majority, it seems that Earl Isla Temerlane spoke for many Dawnish folk when they said, "We will not take actions that condemn souls and keep citizens from the labyrinth. We will not engage in human sacrifice. We will not engage in idolatry. The Duala already takes innocent souls. We do not bow." They are not alone. There has been a lot of concern about the law proposed, but ultimately defeated in the Senate, to drown criminals in the lake to mollify the sovereign. As well as Dawn, there is significant concerns among priests in both Highguard and the League. Even some Verushkans balk at the idea of what amounts to widespread human sacrifice when there are still other avenues that might be explored. With that in mind, Lutomisla liaises with some enchanters from Semerholm and Weirwater, and speaks with a number of the Dawnish knights who have been trying to deal with Duala. They in turn bring their counterparts in Verushka, some of the warden fellowships in Karov, Karsk and Ossium, to speak with her. They have a proposal. The Senate could recognize their work and offer their assistance in increasing its effectiveness. To the surprise of Lutomisla, some of these knights and wardens speak of having received supernatural assistance already. The powerful herald of Eleonaris, known as the Lady of the Semerlak, has offered small boons and enchantments to help them protect people from Duala. These knights, wardens, and enchanters favor a direct approach to the problem of Duala. The sovereign herself is probably unreachable, existing in the depths of the lake. Her creatures, however, are dangerous but ultimately mortal. Courage, steel, and magic together are a match for their malice. As long as they have sufficient warning, knights and wardens could protect not only the lands around the Semerlach, but the ships that ply its waters. The wardens in particular point out that Dualla seems to have little actual affection for her creatures. When they are defeated or driven off, there's been no sign of retaliation. Dualla just moves on to another scheme. It's very much as if, by proving themselves strong enough to resist her wolves, they encourage the sovereign to look elsewhere for easier prey. Blades of the Semerlach. A warden house in Varushka and a knightly estate in Dawn would provide a base of operations for heroes to protect the Semerlach. After several intense discussions, Ludomisla suggests that the Senate establish a small sodality dedicated to protecting the people around the Semerlach. A knightly order and a warden fellowship, supported by imperial heroes, would travel on ships crossing the Semerlach and actively seek out the creatures of Dualla and fight them. They will need places to operate from, an estate in Dawn for the knights and a warden house in Varushka for the wardens. Ludomisla identifies that the best locations would be either Sandling in the vicinity of Kulwich or Lacuve in Semerholm near the bustling port of Laker for the knights, and the port of Korotny in Malamorzy in Korov and the Kostya's Respite in Bittershore in Ossium. This would also be an ideal way to divide the responsibilities, the wardens focusing on protecting boats and the knights on defending communities along the lake. Although they work in two regions, the actual project itself requires only a single commission, and the building of the warden house and the estates will take place in parallel. Once construction was complete, the penalties to fleets would be removed, and any threat to the people who live along the banks of the lake will be met by enthusiastic warriors. It will also create a new adventure available to questing knights, knights errants, and wardens, blades in the Semerlach. This will allow a military unit to spend their time actively defending the Semerlach and the ships that traverse it. The commission would also create a title, Knight Warden of the Semerlach, to oversee the small sodality. This martial title could be appointed by unanimous decision of the Varushkan and Dawnish senators, or it could be appointed by test of arms between combatants from both nations. The title holder would be responsible for protecting the communities around the Semerlach from threats mundane and magical, and to stand ready to oppose the depredations of Dualla whenever they raise their head. In return, they would receive an income of 10 crowns each season with which to equip allies and maintain their sodality. They would also be the beneficiaries of a number of magic items provided by Dawnish, Varushkan and League donors. A duelist scales weapon from the Varushkan merchant boyars to weaken corrupt horrors. A set of golden tide mail from League merchant princes to protect them from venom. And a troubadour's ring from Dawnish earls to help them support their allies. These items would be received once each year, and while the expectation is that the Knight Warden of the Semerlach would use them themselves, there is no reason they could not pass them to other warriors fighting against Dualla or similar monstrous threats. Blades of the Semerlach. Commission type, Folly. Location, Sandling in Weirwater or Lacuve in Semerholm, plus Malamorzy in Korov or Bittershore in Ossium. Cost, 24 weirwood, 72 crowns, 3 months, counts as a single commission. Effect, removes the threat to ships on the Semerlach and establishes adventurers to deal with threats from Dualla. Lady of the Golden Harp. The Archmage of Summer could use a plenipotentiary to request that Eleonoris grant an audience with the Lady of the Semerlach. According to some Kabbalists and enchanters, the Lady of the Semerlach is an enemy of Dualla. If the Senate commissioned the sodality, then once the buildings were complete, it might be possible to gain her favour and support. To do that, the Archmage of Summer would have to send a plenipotentiary to the Lady of Penance, asking her to grant them an audience with her vassal. It's impossible to predict the outcome of any agreement, but a respectful request to her queen would be enough to get a meeting with the lady. If the Lady of the Semerlach agrees to be a patron for knights and wardens protecting the Semerlach, it could prove a valuable boon, providing additional benefits to all the knights and wardens who undertake the efforts to defend the Semirlak from Duala's threat. If the Archmage uses their plenipotentiary to ask the Lion in summer to arrange an audience, they would be well advised not to include any other requests. The Queen of the Fields of Glory is notoriously fickle, and she will not arrange an audience and deal with other matters. At best, she will pick one or the other. Virtues of pride. There's significant resistance to the idea of sacrificing people, even criminals, to the lake's inhabitant. The guidance of the Assembly of Pride is sought on the matter. The Silent Bell expand on Lutomisla's mention that there are a lot of people in Dawn, in particular, that are very much opposed to the idea of sacrificing people to the sovereign. There are real doubts about what happens to the souls of those Duala takes, and the idea of sacrificing people to a sovereign strikes many people as abhorrent. In particular, those who agree with Earl Ayla would very much like to see the matter amplified. It is, they argue, demeaning to the virtuous to throw people to a monster, not least because it has shades of the way the Asavians sacrifice captured priests of the Way, but more importantly, because even criminals, even those who have committed capital crimes, deserve reincarnation and not to be demeaned. As such, the Silent Bell suggests the Assembly of Pride might pass the following mandate to speak to the virtuous of the Empire. The virtuous do not demean others, nor sacrifice the lives of thinking beings to monsters. We send named priest with 75 doses of Liao to remind everyone that we are better than the idolaters and blasphemers who practice such sacrifice. Synod Mandate, Pride Assembly. If this mandate is passed, it will have two effects. If the Senate builds the blades of the Semirlak, virtuous folks from around the Semirlak and beyond will contribute. Dawnish and League citizens will contribute 5 wains of weirwood and 15 crowns to the construction of the Warden House and knightly estates, and will add additional production to the adventure. If the mandate secures a greater majority, meaning it will affect Varushka, the wealthy nation will contribute a further 4 wains and 12 crowns to the construction. More importantly, perhaps, it will send a clear message that the virtuous do not sacrifice people, human, orc, Hilj, or others, to monstrous powers. Building on the effect of the mandate urging imperial citizens to remain vigilant against the machinations of Eternals and dark powers, it will mean that any future attempt by the Empire to intentionally offer sacrifices to an inhuman power will cause virtuous citizens to oppose such an order. Itinerant meddlers. The expertise of Varushka Volhovs suggests a more subtle alternative to either of the others. The Senate could recognize the expertise of the Volhovs and their allies amongst the Geysers and Mountebanks. The nations of Varushka knows the monsters like Duala better than anyone else. Their ancestors slew those they could, and made bargains with those too powerful or dangerous to fight directly. Yet they never lost sight of the fact that the people of Varushka themselves are not monsters. The monsters are what the walls and wards exist to keep away from the folk of the nation. Those who make foolish bargains and bring ruin on themselves and others deserve neither pity nor mercy. Those who transgress in the pursuit of personal power, rather than protecting their people or in the name of survival, are little different than the monsters they deal with. Varushkans can be hard as iron when the situation demands it. The Empire's most notorious army, the Iron Helms, are capable of the most brutal acts of cruelty imaginable, every bit the equal of those propagated by the Druj. But, unlike the Druj, they do so when there are no better choices. They're not sadistic or bloodthirsty. They don't pursue cruelty for its own sake. Varushkans are pragmatic and unforgiving, because life in the north is hard, and often the only choice is the lesser of two evils. But there is always a choice. The long experience of the Varushkans in dealing with sovereigns, however, suggests a different way to deal with Duala. While Lutomisla has been speaking to orcs, knights, and wardens, the Silent Bell have been busy with their own investigation. At their urging, a loose association of Volhov that refer to themselves as Wave Watchers send 3 of their number to visit Lutomisla in Larok. The meeting is actually hosted by a pair of Dawnish yeofolk in the bright costumes favoured by geysers, and a masked representative of the mountebanks of Holberg also attends. It seems that after the statement of principle Velko Peronovich Razaradze raised in spring last year, encouraging citizens of Varushka to teach our Dawnish cousins how to deal with Duala, the Wave Watchers met up with Dawnish folk and League citizens already working in their own way to address the threat of the sovereign to their people. They pooled their resources and expertise, and for the last year or so have been quietly doing their best to counter Duala's influence. The Volhov are itinerant, occult problem solvers. The geysers are likewise travellers who offer their services most often to the yeofolk, and it is the farmers and fisherfolk that have been most impacted by the ravages of Duala's servants. The mountebanks of Holberg, by contrast, have a lot of experience persuading people to agree to deals that are not in their best interest, and have been applying these skills to the servants of Duala, as well as selling their slightly suspect magical expertise to people in their city, desperate for something to protect their ships. The match has not been without its friction, but it has worked moderately well. The magicians between them have worked hard to reduce the damage the sovereign has caused. With sufficient resources, they could do a lot more. Wards and bargains. The Senate could commission a gathering place for the magicians busy protecting the Semerlach. The ability of the magicians to counter Duala's influence is limited both by their access to resources and their relative disorganization. After talking with the Volhov and their allies about what they need, Lutomisla proposes that the Imperial Senate build a trio of squat towers in 3 locations around the lake. At Laker, where the geysers are often drawn to the grand tourneys and fairs regularly held there, at Karotny, and at Kostya's Respite in Bittershore. Only a single commission would need to be spent for the 3 towers, and work would proceed in parallel, allowing them to be built in 3 months. Once built, they would create places that the itinerant magicians of the Semerlach could meet, rest, and prepare. They would establish wards around the lake, and on the vessels of ships at port along its banks, as well as being able to both predict and respond quickly to any threat of Duala's creatures arising from the depths. The Silent Bell have had their own discussions with the Wave Watchers and offer an additional proposal. As part of the commission establishing the Journey Mage Towers, the Senate could create a title, Watcher of the Semerlach. Appointed by the Assembly of Vigilance each year, it would help organise the Volhov, geysers, and occasional mountebank. As long as the Assembly appointed a magician of that archetype to hold the title, they would enjoy the support of the Varushkan merchants, Dawnish yeofolk, and Holberg sailors who most rely on their efforts. Each season, the Watcher of the Semerlach would receive 7 crystal mana from donations made to the Wave Watchers. They'd also receive 3 specific bequests: a Ring of Warding, a magical focus that significantly increases the power of a ritualist to perform warding magic, provided by the Volhov of Varushka, an opaline coat from the Geysers of Dawn to help the magician perform personal magic in pursuit of their goals, and a grab bag of potions, useful to magicians, collected and delivered by the mountebanks of Holberg. 3 potions each season: a Mage Blood, a Baron Watchtower, and a decoction of the Hungry Moon, or their equivalent for another realm. The title holder could email plot@profouddecisions.co.uk to change the realm. Lutomisla queries the suggestion that the Assembly of Vigilance, rather than the Conclave, appoint this title, but the Silent Bell point out that the responsibilities of the Watchers of the Semerlach are about vigilance first and magic secondly. There's no requirement for the holder of the title to be a magician, as long as they uphold the traditions of the Volhov, the Geyser, or the Mountebank. Journey Mage Towers. Commission type: Folly. Location: Laker in Semerholm, Malamorzi in Karov, and Bittershore in Ossium. Cost: 24 white granite, 72 crowns, and 3 months. Effect: removes the threat to ships on the Semerlach and establishes a small sodality to protect the area. Virtues of Wisdom. The joint effort between magicians of Varushka, Dawn, and Holberg intrigues several wise ones. They seek the guidance of the Assembly of Wisdom. While the Silent Bell are talking to Lutomisla, they are also meeting with vigilant wise ones who are particularly keen to see the Journey Mage Towers built. There are a number of arguments raised. but they boil down to the fact that several of them favour an approach to the Semirlak that builds on the traditions of Varushka. Making offering smacks of idolatry and risks Duala simply deciding she wants more. The Warden and the Knights are courageous, but they are a blunt instrument. Much better, argue these wise ones, to take a subtle, reactive approach that is more likely to be able to adapt to anything Duala throws at the people of the Semirlak. They also seem to approve of the way the Volhov are working with their counterparts in other nations to address the threat. They'd like to see that element encouraged by the Imperial Synod. That kind of adaptability is key to what many of them consider to be the virtue of wisdom. The wise know that their knowledge is incomplete, and there is always more to learn. We send named priest with 50 liao to support the Volhov of Varushka, working with geysers and mountebanks, to protect the people of the Semirlak from Duala, both to teach and to learn. Synod Mandate, Wisdom Assembly. If this mandate is passed, it will have two effects. If the Senate builds the Journey Mage Towers, virtuous folk from around the Semirlak and beyond will contribute. Daunish and League citizens will contribute 5 wains and 15 crowns to the construction of the towers, and an additional 2 mana crystals each season to the Watcher. If the mandate secures a greater majority, meaning it will have full effect in Varushka as well, the wealthy nation will contribute a further 4 wains and 12 crowns to the construction, and another 2 mana crystals each season. More importantly, perhaps, it will send a clear message that the wise approve of this coming together of nations. It will recognise that while geysers and mountebanks are not often trusted by their people, their skills are nonetheless important. It will encourage more communication between the 3 traditions of magic, and in future may lead to further opportunities for geysers, mountebanks and Volhov to pool their resources to achieve their ambitions. Star Metal and Fishes. Ludomisla suggests that one of the Archmages could use a plenipotentiary to ask an Eternal of their realm to arrange a meeting with Duala to negotiate for access to the contents of the lake. The Senate has made it illegal to take things from the Semirlak, meaning a reduction in taxation and also preventing Ilium from being recovered from its depths. It's also had implications for the new ports built in Varushka. None of the proposals here address these issues. In fact, they all assume that the law preventing things being removed from the lake will stay in place. Removing the law would likely anger Duala again and create a new set of problems that these proposals are not designed to entirely contain. Most of the damage Duala is currently doing is based around her creatures, but as mentioned previously, the Sovereign is very jealous of the things that lie in her depths. Going back to taking fish and Ilium out of the lake requires diplomacy, magical diplomacy. There are 4 Eternals that might be prevailed on to arrange a meeting with Duala. Lashanar of the Night Realm is always eager to arrange situations where creatures speak to one another. Prospero of the Autumn Realm loves situations where beings attempt to influence one another. Ephesus, also of the Autumn Realm, is obsessed with trade in all its forms, and Jaehaerys, for all his dark reputation, has a vested interest in the idea of parleys, formal diplomacy between courts and dark magic. Ludomisla suggests that after the main problem of Duala is dealt with, one of the Archmages could use their plenipotentiary ability to petition one of these 4 Eternals to arrange a meeting with the Sovereign to talk about the Ilium and the fishing industry along the Semirlak. There's no real point in doing it now. The Empire will be approaching the creature from a position of weakness. Once they have taken decisive steps to deal with the main problem, the beast attacking ships and seeking to drown lands, then would be the time to talk to her about more specific matters. She proposes that as long as the Eternal is amenable, it will be important to have representatives of each of the territories bordering the Semirlak, enchanters from Semerholm and Weirwater, magicians from Holberg, and Volhov or Kabbalists from Korov, Karsk and Ossium, as well as the title holders affected. If the Archmage words their plenipotentiary specifically, Ludomisla is confident that it would be possible to open negotiations with Netripper. If the Archmage uses their plenipotentiary to ask the Eternal to arrange an audience, they would be well advised not to include any other requests. Whoever they speak to will not arrange an audience and deal with other matters. They will pick one or the other. Destroy the Semirlak. The Empire could appraise a way to destroy the Semirlak and presumably destroy Duala in the process. There is one final proposal that almost doesn't make it to the appraisal, but is added at the last minute. One of Lutomisla's colleagues, she won't say exactly who, had a slightly more radical proposal, and one that would almost certainly destroy Duala. The creature lives in the Semerlak, so one way to deal with her threat would be to remove the Semerlak. Immense dams could be built to drain the lake and redirect the waters that flow into it. Once the lake was drained dry, Duala would either die or be rendered vulnerable to attack. Obviously, this would be an astronomically expensive project and would require an appraisal all its own. It would cause massive disruption, ruin what remains of the fishing industry, wreck the territories in unpredictable ways, and perhaps more importantly, ruin existing Varushkin, Dawnish, and Holberg ports and docks. But it would end the threat of Duala for as long as the lake remained dry. Ringing louder. The Silent Bell has prepared a report for the Cardinal. They plan to make both this report and that about the Tutaman public with the assistance of the Department of Historical Research. The Assembly of Nine may tell them not to do this. While they have been treading the same path as Lutomisla in several places, the Silent Bell have also been performing their own investigations in the Semerlak. They've prepared a report on their findings and will deliver it at the summer solstice to the Cardinal of Vigilance. They're also intending to provide their delayed report on the Tutaman for the throne. One of the things that has delayed their report has been an argument among a number of well-known members of the sodality about the practice of providing secret letters. It smacks for some of the Urizen and Marcher members in particular of conspiracy and underhanded behaviour, and they are uncomfortable with it. While the cardinals who direct their interest can clearly be trusted, they see little value in hiding the things they uncover about threats from the virtuous. They point specifically to the successes around the heirs of Terranel and the recent report they made about the cults of Agrement. With that in mind, they intend to provide copies of the letters they are sending to the Council of Nine, shorn of any personal elements, to the Department of Historical Research. Leontes the Scribe, the Imperial Archivist, is prepared to make copies available alongside traditional historical research. There's a rumour that he is wooing the sodality with an eye towards attempting to co-opt them into the department, although there's no sign any of the Vigilant are interested in his offers. If the Nine does not want one or both of these reports to be shared with those citizens of the Empire who are interested in such things, a statement of principle to that effect raised in their assembly would discourage the members of the Silent Bell from doing so. It's likely to exacerbate the conflict within the sodality between secrecy and sharing what they uncover, however. A little bit of overkill. None of the appraisals or mandates on this page are competing. Any one of the three proposals, the Semerlak toll booth, the Blades of the Semerlak, or the Journey Mage Towers, will resolve the immediate threat of Duala to fleets and the regions abutting the lake. Should the Senate wish, however, it could enact any or all of them. The titles and commissions will have their other effects. Likewise, the three mandates are not competing. While they will only provide construction benefits to specific commissions, their other effects will occur regardless. For example, the Prosperity Assembly could enact the mandate to reassure people that it is not idolatry to pay tithes and tolls regardless of whether the Senate commissions the toll booth. Bear in mind, however, that the mandates are only available during the summer solstice, as with any other mandate.